Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oscar Ortiz here, Superintendent of Heritage Classical Academy, a proposed tuition-free public charter school with a classical model that we hope to open in Houston, Texas. Welcome once again to All Things Classical, a live stream by Heritage Classical Academy. And we're continuing our series on racism and the classics. And today we have an exciting show for you, but before we begin, we always like to start with a few housekeeping items. Number one, we've been having a few technical difficulties today. Our streaming is been a little bit poor. So if you see or notice a lag, we do apologize for that inconvenience. We will make sure to have a much better system up for our next interview. Number two, Heritage Classical Academy offers or sponsors these live streams for free in the hopes that the information that we provide you, the resources and the materials, go to benefit your local communities. What we want to do in the end is encourage the everyday citizen to either join or open their own classical school. And third, number three, please stay behind with us after this interview so we can go over a few things about Heritage Classical Academy with your help. And what I mean by help is with your likes, your retweets, your follows, you can help us accomplish our goal as a future school, which is to open a little classical free school in Houston, Texas. You can follow us at the website that you see at the bottom, www.heritageclassicalhouston.org, and you can follow us on our other platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, which you are on now. If you are currently on Twitter, please go ahead and retweet us so that we can draw more people to this live stream interview. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. With me tonight, I have Dr. David Withun. He is an author as well as a head of school at Jacksonville, Florida. Is that correct, Dr. Withun?
It is at Jacksonville Classical Academy.
Classical, and this is the first year that you're open, correct?
This is our second year.
Second year, excuse me. And how many students do you have currently right now?
Just short of 750 students in grades K through 7.
Unbelievable. K through 7, 750 students. That's quite a school already. And I imagine you're going to expand all the way K-12.
We are, yeah. We're adding a grade every year. So we'll be K through 8 next year, and we'll grow to about 1,300 students in K through 12.
Fantastic. So I have a couple of questions for you prepared for tonight. However, I want our audience to get to know you a little bit more. So I'm just going to read out a little bit about who you are on the bio that you can find at Dr. Withun's website, which is www.davidwithun.com. Let me put that up on the screen so everyone can see that. davidwithun.com. So Dr. Withun is a veteran of the United States Army. He earned his master's and his PhD in humanities at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama. He is particularly interested in the influences and responses to ancient, classical, and medieval philosophy, mythology, in 20th century African American thought. Dr. Withun's writing has been published in many journals and magazines such as Classical Receptions Journal, Black Perspectives, Phylon, Formal Journal, and The Explicator. His first book, which we're excited to discuss tonight a little as well, was picked up by Oxford University Press, and I believe it's already been published. Is that right?
Officially March 15th. So
15th, just a few more days. But okay, fantastic. Because a month ago when we were talking, I recall you mentioned it would be available by March. So just one more week.
Yes.
Fantastic. However, we are putting the link to Dr. Withun's book on our YouTube webpage. So if you're interested in supporting a scholar, helping Dr. Withun and his ideas, just spread far and wide, please check out his book on the link that we've provided. Okay, his book is called Co-Workers in the Kingdom of Culture, Classics and Cosmopolitanism Cosmopolitanism in the Thought of W.E.B. Du Bois. Welcome, Dr. Withun. Thank you for being with us tonight. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm great.
How is Florida right now? In Texas, we thought we had finally reached the warm weather, and today, as you can tell, I'm wearing my cardigan. It's all of a sudden under 50 degrees, which is freezing for us.
Well, Florida goes through this phase this time of year where it's too cold for me in the morning and a little too warm for me in the afternoon, but it finally settles typically in April. So
Unbelievable. Well, it looks like you're comfortable right now, so either you have a heater on or it's comfortably just
air conditioning.
Air conditioning. Okay, there you go. Okay, so Dr. Withun, I'm very interested in your work because it's just fascinating to see that within the classical movement, there is this interest in the Black intellectual tradition and the way in which it has, it's just growing nowadays, and the way that it's influencing some of our schools as well. Tell us a little bit about your research. Why W.E.B. Du Bois? What made you go that route?
Well, I first met Du Bois, and by met, of course, I began to read the works of Du Bois. I feel like I've been living with him for a decade now. When I was in my first year of graduate school, and it was not assigned reading. I actually was looking for something a little bit apart from the assigned reading, and it was a book, Souls of Black Folk specifically, that was on my list that I had been meaning to read for a long time, and I read it in just a couple of sittings. We met in my backyard where I lived in Savannah, Georgia at the time, and I called up I was kind of frantically searching for what I wanted to write my master's thesis about. And I called up my advisor at the time and said, I've got to do it on Souls of Black Folk. And he said, run with it.
Wow.
And that was almost 10 years ago now. And so I've been deeply immersed in not just Souls of Black Folk, but all of Du Bois's work since then.
It's a great book. I've read it a couple times. It's just one of those books where you can't get enough out of it. There's always more. What was it about it, however, in your case, that made you say, I need to write on this author?
Yeah. Well, he spoke to the moment that I was in. I had just begun teaching. The same time that I started working on my master's degree, I also started teaching, which I don't recommend, but it worked for me. And I was teaching at a school, a classical school in Savannah. Just about 80% of our students were African American.
Okay.
And we were encountering many of the same critiques that Du Bois and his allies in the fight for liberal education at that point in history were encountering. There's a very heavy emphasis on technical vocational training,
yes,
and not liberal education, especially for students from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, but in education more generally as well. So we were coming up against much of that. And I had, students were asking questions. It was the fact that Homer and Plato and Aristotle are all of our heritage was not always evident for our students, for their parents, for people involved in education locally.
Oh, that's excellent.
So I would get questions, like a young man in my 6th grade class at the time, who, after we had studied Greece and Rome for some time, asked when we were going to study Black history. And it was a valid question, right? But it was not making what I was hoping was the connections that my students were making in seeing that this is, the history of Greece and Rome is their history as well, and that it is, because it is good and true and beautiful, that it is the heritage of all people.
Yes.
And so Du Bois spoke to all of those things. At that moment, reading Souls of Black Folk was like somebody had taken all of the thoughts that were sort of tossing around in my mind and that weren't quite coherent, and had put them into eloquent prose.
Yes, and it reads like almost a poem. It's just beautiful how eloquent Du Bois can be just poetic, and that's what makes it so enjoyable to read as well. It's a text that it's challenging, it's difficult, but it feels like you're being nourished all the time. It doesn't feel like you're, working strenuously to try to get somewhere. It almost feels like he carries you along the way, which is something that I quite enjoy. I don't know if that was your experience of it, but certainly it was for me. Now, just so that our audience knows a little bit about Du Bois before we jump into the more meatier questions, how much did he write in his lifetime? And can you tell us in broad strokes just a little bit about who he was, and what were his aspirations, and kind of his time, also his timeline?
Sure. Yeah, he was a prolific writer, to say the least. I think the final count is something like 21 books,
Wow.
as well as numerous monographs. There were 16 sociological studies that he published while at Atlanta University that are not included in that 21. Hundreds of essays, poems, a number of short stories, and in his lifetime, it was 95 years long, and so he was certainly had plenty of time to write, but was producing, writing at almost a feverish pace over the majority of his lifetime. So he was born in 1868, and so right at the end of the Civil War, the beginning of Reconstruction. So 3 years after the Civil War, it ended. February of 1868, and he died the night before Martin Luther King delivered the "I Have a Dream" speech in August of 1963. So 95 years old.
Amazing.
His life stretches from the emancipation, the end of slavery, basically, the Civil War, to the midst of the high point of the Civil Rights era, and he was involved in everything in between. So he's a figure often associated with the Harlem Renaissance. He's a novelist, he's a poet, he's a sociologist, he is a historian. He published the first major works of African American and of African history.
Yes.
So he has his hand in just about everything, but all of it with the goal of achieving liberation and achieving equality for all people.
That's awesome.
It starts with a focus on the African American narrative, but expands to anti-colonialism, particularly after World War II, and to Pan-Africanism, and the anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia as well. So very prolific, and again, with that kind of focus on equality and on liberty for all people.
Well, I can't wait to jump into that with you, because I would like for you to draw out the connections between his desire to liberate and education, in particular classical education. For those of our viewers who have not read The Soul of Black Folk, it is also one of the most remarkable, I would say, what would you call it, Dr. Withun? He's advocating for a classical education, and the importance of it, especially for peoples that have been oppressed. And obviously, I'm not the W.E.B. Du Bois scholar, so I'd like for you to talk more about that. But before we do, a quick announcement to our viewers. Please make sure to follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you do, go ahead and click on that like button and the bell. Don't forget the bell. I see a lot of my viewers are forgetting the bell. The bell notifies you every time we go live, or any time that we upload a video to our YouTube channel. You don't want to miss out, because we have some great content that we are producing that is going to be uploaded soon, that you could use for either your schools, your classrooms, if you're homeschooling, or if you want to have some resources to help you talk about classical education to your friends. So let's go quickly into a big question right here, Dr. Withun. I'm going to pull up a quote because I want to read directly from the text itself, so our viewers and listeners can experience Du Bois for themselves. And in this quote, Du Bois brings up a very interesting theme, which is the idea of a color line and also the idea of a veil. And he capitalizes veil. So I'm just going to read it out loud for our viewers. Quote, "For the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." End quote. And then in a different section, he says, quote, "I have sketched in swift outline the two worlds within and without the veil, and thus have come to the central problem of training men for life." So let me go back to you, Dr. Withun, real fast. The color line and the veil, those two terms, are those originally Du Bois's terms, or was he using those from somewhere else?
Well, he's drawing on a number of sources, and it's hard to kind of put together because his thought moves fast, and he sees these connections, and I'm looking forward to seeing a few more of the quotes that
Yes.
you have in mind for discussion, because there are some that really start to make those connections in interesting ways.
Yes.
So color line, of course, he's referring to sort of the legal separation of races through segregation. The veil can be seen as an allusion to the veil of the temple, of course, rent by Christ, or through the crucifixion of Christ in the Gospels. There is a connection in another passage in Souls of Black Folk that I hope we'll get to, where he talks about sitting with Shakespeare, and there's a very clear kind of allusion there to Galatians chapter 3. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, and so on. And the idea being the breaking down of the separation of people by culture, by race, by color, so on, and rising to truth with a capital T. And this is something that Du Bois does consistently throughout his career. It's always the Platonic capital T when he writes the word truth, because it points to something beyond the veil, right? Beyond the kind of petty bigotries of the day, the separations of the day. Hence the subtitle to my book, right? Classics and Cosmopolitanism,
Yes.
the breaking down of those barriers and the becoming of, in a sense, world citizens.
In your mind, who is he writing this book for? Because when I read it, it doesn't seem like his audience is immediately other African Americans. It seems to be written specifically for a white audience. And let me explain that a little bit. It seems like he's trying to give people access to a world behind that veil. Am I interpreting that correctly, or is that is that a little bit far-fetched?
No, you're entirely correct.
Okay.
He is most certainly writing for a white audience.
Okay.
They would have been, the primary audience that
That's
consumed literary works at the time. And he is most certainly trying to give a peek behind the veil. And I'm thinking of one chapter in particular in Souls of Black Folk, where he describes his own experiences as a teacher at a school for the children of the freedmen in rural Tennessee. So while he was an undergraduate student at Fisk University in Nashville, during his summers and in time off from his own education, he would go out into the countryside along with many of his classmates and teach at these small Black rural schools. And he gives a peek into the home life of the people who live in this town. He gives a peek into kind of the social dynamics, the relationships that his white audience, his white reading audience, would never have access to.
It's that was one of my favorite chapters because it really describes in a way that I'm not a poet. I couldn't have done it as well as Du Bois does, the struggles that as a head of school, and I know that you're also head of school, sometimes we face trying to speak not just to parents about what a classical education is, but mostly people who are opposed to a classical education. And this is what I find so fascinating. Du Bois is having the same issue several decades ago, and you would think it's more likely that the opposition should exist then, but it's a bit shocking that we're still having to explain to others that a classical education is actually good, fruitful, and beneficial to our minority children. Any thoughts about that?
He's explaining it to different audiences, right? He has to explain it in that chapter in particular. He has to explain it to these, poor, rural, many of them formerly enslaved people, who don't see how any of this book learning applies to their children.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, and this is one of those many references that he just kind of drops in, but that are
Yes.
really this part of this much wider nexus. He says that when he says something to the effect of that his class would slowly dwindle away over the course of the
Yes.
semester,
Yes.
and so he would find himself trudging up the hill to
Mm-hmm.
justify to the parents why they should be sending their children to school.
Mm-hmm.
How little things change in 120 years.
Yes.
But he would appeal to Cicero's
Yes.
Proarchia.
Quote Cicero to persuade
so
a parent.
And he specifically names the Proarchia, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's a defense of a poet who was something of an outsider to the Romans, right? So Archias is a Greek.
Interesting.
He is of dubious citizenship status.
Wow.
And he's a poet, right? And so there is, and so Du Bois doesn't make it clear. He doesn't lay it out and say, listen, this is a metaphor for African Americans, but it's clear what he's pointing us in the direction
Mm-hmm.
of, which is that Archias is a kind of symbol for African Americans themselves. That he associates the sorrow songs, the spirituals, right, with this kind of message for the world he believes that African Americans and their culture have. And so we have poets who are outsiders and their citizenship status is being questioned, right? Much like Archias. But Cicero in his Proarchia kind of, he's almost dismissive of the charge that Archias isn't a real citizen. He goes, it's obvious that he is, the records will show, but even if he wasn't a citizen, he deserves to be because of his status as poet.
Amazing.
And then it becomes an extended defense of a liberal education.
Amazing. Amazing.
And this is Du Bois pointing us in the direction of his thought.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. So I want to go a little deeper into that because as you're reading the text, Du Bois also brings out, he emphasizes quite a bit this double seeing or double consciousness. And I'm going to pull up a quote again because I want our viewers to read it for themselves. Let me go ahead and pull that up. He says, quote, and this is in The Souls of Black Folk, quote, "The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." So there's, again, back to the image of the veil, back to the idea of the color line, but there's also this lived experience. So it's not just this abstract, there's a line, right? It's not all in the law. It's not legalities. It's not just, it's an actual experienced thing that a vast majority of the population doesn't have access to, right? So he's giving them access into this, or behind the veil, so they can see this. Talk to us a little bit about that, because the way that he describes it seems to suggest that it is, at least in the conscience of white Americans, it is a problem. So and to a certain degree, they're aware of it, but they're aware of it as a problem that they just want to get rid of as opposed to resolve. Am I reading correctly the text at this point?
That I think you are, and I want to go back and answer the question
Please.
that you didn't ask.
Go ahead.
The seventh son is also worth pointing out what he's referring to there, because what precedes that quote is a list of kind of successive civilizations.
The
right?
Greeks.
I don't remember which ones are in this particular list, but the Teuton and the Mongol, after the Egyptian and the Indian, the Teuton and the Mongol, etc. Right?
Yes.
So he lists these successive civilizations, and this is something that Du Bois does several times in Souls of Black Folk. He does it again in a number of later works. The list changes from time to time, but what's important about the list is whether it is a list of figures or a list of civilizations, he is drawing on the contemporary milieu of historiography, the Hegelian influenced milieu of historiography, right? That posits these kind of cycles of civilizations and, the succession of civilizations over time. But he is very careful to emphasize the cosmopolitan nature of that list, right? That this is not this is not just one continent. This is not just one group of people. There is a give and take and a constant interplay of civilizations.
Yes.
That's important to him, and the point that he's making. To move on though to the double vision. Du Bois is, there are not many sociologists who are also poets, probably with good reason.
We don't give them a classical education anymore. Is one reason.
That may be one reason.
Yes.
But Du Bois, of course, had a classical education, and so he was capable of writing both works of sociology as well as works of poetry.
Art.
And here you see, right, you see the sociologist in dialogue with the poet in his description of double vision, right? And of the veil, and all of these kind of related concepts. One of Du Bois's major works before Souls of Black Folk was The Philadelphia Negro, which he published in 1899. And this is the result of just an amazing amount of effort on Du Bois's part. So he wanted to produce a true, look behind the veil. And he lived in the Black community in Philadelphia, went and lived there himself, and went door to door and interviewed every African-American resident of Philadelphia at the time, right? And the results of his survey were published in this book. And so here is the sociologist, right, giving a look behind the veil. He can't help himself from appealing to his classical education even there. He says, sort of in conclusion, after looking at all of this data that he's compiled, the problem facing this African-American community and all others like it is the same as the age-old problems that have faced mankind. And he goes back to Roman history to, for some of his reference points there in this kind of conclusion to the Philadelphia Negro. And now he's taking up the same concept, the veil and double vision and the hiding of the kind of separation of the races in legality as well as in culture, and the hiding of real African-American life behind the veil from the white majority. And he's turning it into these sort of poetical visions of it, right? So double vision and the veil can also be seen as a kind of reference to blindness, which of course is accompanied with a second sight. In Greek mythology, for example, you have Tiresias, the blind seer, right? Or Homer, right? The blind bard.
Yes.
And again, if we want to cycle back to bards being the singers of the great epics, we could again turn to the idea of the sorrow songs.
It's remarkable,
So you see the kind of web that he is putting together in weaving together these allusions, these references to form this whole, right?
It truly is amazing how he draws from the ancients, and we're not just looking at the Greeks and the Romans here, but I mean it's remarkable how he can draw from them meaning. And with that meaning, he can really explain and interpret reality as he is living it today, and not just for himself, but create such a beautiful work of art through Souls of Black Folk, for example. And this is the only text that I've actually read. I know he's written a lot, as you pointed out, but through that work then give meaning to hundreds of thousands of others. And now, myself, for example, I'll just use myself an example. After reading the text, I go out and live my life, and I draw from the text, allusions to the text in my own experience now. It's incredible how much richer my life is as a result. So, I mean, there seems to be different layers of just drawing meaning from the ancient wisdom of the classics. And I want to get to that because this double vision does seem to be a little bit of a handicap, isn't it, right? It just seems to be a struggle that Du Bois is trying to portray for us, for those of us who haven't been on the other side of the veil, but only live on one side of the veil. And in his book, yes.
It is a kind of blindness, right? And so in that sense, it is a handicap. But there is also, and this is why he calls it prophetic, right? Or a second sight. There is a prophetic aspect to it, in that what he's doing is pointing to the minority experience, and specifically the experience of an oppressed minority. And they are handicapped, of course, by being oppressed, but at the same time granted almost a deeper vision of the society that they live in, because they see the flaws that are hidden from the majority. Those at the top can't see the holes in the leaky ship at the bottom, right? And it's those in the bottom that see the flaws, that see the problems, and so have a kind of special sight where they see, in a sense, more than do those that are at the top.
What would you say then is his ultimate goal with the text itself? When I've read it, it seems to be I don't want to use the word manifesto, but it does seem to have some kind of spirit towards solution, towards improvement, towards giving maybe his people a way out or forward.
Sure. And those are undoubtedly, and even the title itself is radical in its own time, because it is proclaiming the fundamental humanity of Black people, which was in 1903 not a given. And so, and specifically the use of the terms soul and folk are important, because these are also references to Hegelian historiography. And so you have Du Bois writing Black people, African Americans in this case, but he will later widen this with a focus on Africa, to full personhood in the sense of being partakers in world civilization, right? So Hegel, states flat out in one of his works, Africa has no history. And Du Bois would prove him wrong somewhat later in 1915 when Du Bois publishes his own work of African history. But it begins here, right? It begins with Souls of Black Folk, with saying there is a folk, and he's drawing on the German, the German with a V, right? The folk, the people. Du Bois, of course, some of his graduate training was done in Germany at Friedrich Wilhelm University. So he was trained, by people that were themselves Hegelians in many cases, and so he's using their terminology, but inserting that Black before folk makes it. It upturns the assumptions of the Hegelians. It upturns the assumptions of his own time, and asserts this. Makes this radical assertion of fundamental equality for all people.
We with that, it sounds like we're starting to get into the Du Bois that I love the most, which is the fighter. I mean, Du Bois, just as a poet, like a poet, he can really throw and he can hurl some insults as well in his criticism, and it's remarkable. I do recommend our viewers to get the book Souls of Black Folk. We are also linking it to the bottom of this YouTube live stream if they'd like to see it. It is just poetry to see how he can criticize those who he disagrees with, and in particular those who would argue that African Americans should not study the classics or not have a classical education, which is the reason we're having this live stream, because we are facing once again today the same opposition, which I found just stunning. I thought we had finally gotten out of the, we'd finally moved beyond that, but we're still back in the same place. So let's go to that, to the fighter, because there is a figure, right? A historical figure, but also there's a whole chapter dedicated to this other man in his book, and it is a criticism of this new leader that has gained in so much popularity, and I'm talking about Booker T. Washington. And most people who know Du Bois know him in relation to Booker T. Washington. So I wanted to avoid starting there for that reason, because I believe Du Bois is really a giant on his own. In fact,
He's more
he's
than
more.
just Washington's interlocutor, right? Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about the controversy surrounding these two men. Who was on what side? And I'll ask you in the end, who do you think won out? Who won?
Well,
so go ahead.
So Booker T. Washington and Du Bois are on opposite sides to some extent of the question of how the freedmen, the children of the freedmen, grandchildren of the freedmen should be educated, right? Both of them, and it's a much bigger battle than just education, because both of them fundamentally are trying to assert their leadership really within the African American community after the death of Frederick Douglass in 1895, right? And Washington takes a very early lead, but Du Bois rises to challenge in 1903 with the chapter of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others in Souls of Black Folk.
Yes.
And Washington, and I don't want to caricature his philosophy because there is some complexity to it, but the kind of bare bones outline is he views building a Black civilization, which is essentially what he and Du Bois both acknowledge that they're trying to do, as starting by literally laying the bricks. Right, you've got to train people to be good workers and to have the good habits of good workers. And one of the things that Washington said that drew Du Bois's ire was that he sees as much that is edifying in a leaf of cabbage as in a page of Latin. So you see, Washington's kind of take on things, right? Let's start with the base. Let's be good farmers. Let's be good workers. Let's be, good engineers, and let's focus on the vocational and the technical. And Du Bois, though, he takes the opposite perspective in that he believes that in order to build a civilization, you've got to start from the top down. You have to have prophets, seers, leaders, poets, people with a vision who can guide the rest of, you need the workers, right? Du Bois is never, he never says you don't need bricklayers, but the bricklayers need somebody with vision to lead them. And if you don't produce that from among African Americans themselves, so if you don't educate a group that Du Bois refers to as the talented 10th, right? If you don't have the leaders grown from our own community, Du Bois says, then where are they going to come from? Well, they're going to come from the white community. And the result is that you're going to have a permanent Black laboring caste in the South and a permanent white leader class that will oversee them. And so the African American community needs to grow its own leaders. And the only way to do that is the way that it's always been done, which is a liberal education, a classical education.
Yes. Now, quickly, I want to push on a little bit on that, because it seems at this point, at least, that the argument would be, well, this is the only way that it's always been done, therefore we should do it this way. But is that really Du Bois's argument, or is there something intrinsic about a liberal education that no matter, just think of it today, there are so many options, if you will, educational options. And the word of the day is, let's give our parents options, which I'm all about. But I don't believe all options are equal. I think some are better than others. And obviously, I'm not doing this because I'm biased. Obviously, I love a classical education. And I found that one particular path was, for me, the best one. So is there in Du Bois's mind a similar argument, or is it just this is the only what's available?
Du Bois puts a great deal of emphasis on that word liberal in liberal education, right? Okay. That this is a liberating education, and he is very meticulous in linking that liberating aspect of a liberal education to a unity with truth and to a rising above the veil. For him to be liberated to be liberated is to be liberated from separation and from bigotry and from all of the things that divide us as human beings, to get a glimpse above the veil, right? And this is very much what he describes as what is necessary for the talented 10th, for those who will be leaders, to have a bigger,
Excellent.
wider vision of the world, and not just see there. If you're only seeing your own little place within it, then you don't have the vision that is wide enough to assume that mantle of leadership.
Oh, that's beautiful. Can we develop that a little more? Because I can see, right? CAN. I can see the argument which in Du Bois's favor, which suggests if all we give our people is a vocational training, or I believe in the term that was popular at the time was an industrial education, then we are not developing that sense of sight, right? We're not giving individuals of genius, I think is the term he also uses, or one of the terms he uses, the way above that, right? Wouldn't you say that is an argument that would make a lot of sense to our families today, or is it lost already and among all the different currencies of of options that we have?
That it would or wouldn't make a lot of sense.
That it would.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, I definitely think that it would, because it is giving it is pulling you out of your very small place in time and space, right? And giving you a broader vision of that these are wider. Think about Du Bois and the Philadelphia Negro drawing on Roman history to describe what he sees as the problems of an African American community in Philadelphia in 1899. That these are human problems. These are not problems that are unique to 1899 Philadelphia. And because they are human problems, we can look to the wisdom of those who have overcome these problems in the past and draw on that wisdom to forge our own way ahead. And so we are given a kind of second sight, to use that term, by being liberated, by receiving this liberal education.
Now, he points out that Booker T. Washington is actually hurting the African American community, and he's very, he doesn't hold back. He's really upset about this situation because it's actually, I think there are three things that are being taken away, three things that have already been accomplished. And he points out Frederick Douglass, he points out other great leaders in the Black intellectual tradition that have won us these things. And now Booker T. Washington is, I think he says it's a strategy of appeasement or compromise, I believe. And he's giving up our rights to vote. He's giving up our opportunity for education. And there's a third one that's escaping me right now.
Civic equality.
Civic equality. And I think it all comes down to a document that was it drafted by Booker T. Washington, the Atlanta Compromise? Could you talk a little bit about the Atlanta Compromise?
Yeah, it's a speech that he gave in 1895 at the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition, and I don't know that I would say that it defined his philosophy, but it certainly set a tone, and it was his willingness to compromise with the South, with the white South, by brokering a deal, right? We will accept social segregation. We'll accept, this is when all of these, the Jim Crow laws are coming into place, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, the decision is made just a year after the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition Address, so 1896. So all of these segregation laws in the South, the black codes and so on, they're all passing at this time. He says, fine, we'll accept this in exchange for economic cooperation, hire black workers, basically, right? Look, the term that he uses is "drop your bucket where you are,"
Yes.
referencing a story about a ship that's looking for fresh water that's been at sea, and it turns out the fresh water is in fact where they are because they were in a river the whole time, right? So
Yes.
drop your bucket where you are. He's saying, here we are, right here. You don't have to hire, from Europe, the immigrants that are coming in. You can look to the black folk of the South, and we'll be your workers.
Hmm.
And in exchange for this kind of economic compromise, we will accept, for now, essentially a state of social inferiority through segregation.
Yes, yes, and that's what Du Bois essentially says, which is he's given up. He's
Right.
given up on us.
If you are willing to allow this backtracking, on the again, think of of Cicero and
Wow.
his Archias that he's
Wow.
defending, right? We had citizenship, he says. This is 1865. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments
Yes.
gave us the right to vote, made us citizens, and now you're backtracking. You're allowing it to go back, says Du Bois.
Amazing. Now, I know historically the two men in the end kind of reconciled. Is that right? But their legacy. This is what's most interesting to me because when I as a student, I read the story and I was very eager to learn more about Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and this whole controversy. I I left that research very disheartened at the result. It seemed to me that Booker T. Washington had won this cultural war and that it's extended to this day. Because here I find myself having to defend the classics and classical education and give parents reasons for giving their children alongside a vocational track, if they wish, or vocational skills, giving them an education that would broaden their sight, as Du Bois points out, elevate their soul, give them reasons to aspire for greater things, if you will. But did Booker T. Washington really win in the end? Who are the spiritual children of Du Bois, in other words? Could you speak a little bit about that?
I don't know if Washington won, but he probably came closer than Du Bois. If we look, the very term college and career readiness to me sounds a whole lot like something that Washington would be okay with, right?
Yeah.
So there is definitely a vocational, industrial, right, whatever term we want to use, bent to contemporary education. There is obviously a great deal of focus on a career track and the importance of
Yes.
ultimately of money making. It seems as the end of education, which is of course what Du Bois was very much against. But the grandchildren and great grandchildren of Du Bois are they're here as well. They're here anytime that there is an access to liberal education, especially by people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. The spirit of Du Bois, so to speak, is there. The very fact that African and African American history are subjects that are taught in schools is the legacy of Du Bois.
Yes.
His book, his 1915 book, The Negro, his 1915 pageant, The Star of Ethiopia, were some of the first attempts to bring the history of Africa and the history of African Americans to the public. And not just to a white public, but to African Americans themselves. And the very first course in African American history at a university was founded just a few years later as a result of Du Bois's work. Right, it was a graduate student at the
Fantastic.
time, whose name escapes me at the moment, that started the program because he was influenced by Du Bois's work. And so there is a presence of Du Bois that certainly had an impact, and I wish that he would have had a greater one in that getting his point across that liberal education, the centrality of liberal education for all people, is something that we still, I think, need to press today.
Absolutely. Now, the civil rights movement itself, Would you say that it has so I'm thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. here, and I know that he had a relationship with W.E.B. Du Bois, and himself was, you could argue, was classically educated or had an education in the liberal arts.
Sure.
So, would you say that the civil rights movement and a lot of what we're seeing today is more closely connected to Du Bois and his work than it could have ever been to Booker T. Washington's work and his position?
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, the civil rights movement and its call for, immediate equality and for voting rights for African Americans and the protection thereof, and the more contemporary, the recent, demand for full civic and social equality for all people is certainly part of the legacy of Du Bois, kind of outside of education and in the wider culture. Du Bois, again, the demands are clear, simple, straightforward, and radical for their time in souls of Black folks: civic equality, the right to vote, access to liberal education. He expands those in later statements. The 1905 Niagara Statement, for example, his credo, to encompass much more. But the emphasis on, again, on liberty and equality for everybody and immediate, not a little bit at a time, is certainly part of the legacy of Du Bois.
So, Dr. Withun, we're coming to an end here, so I want to get to one last theme that Du Bois has throughout his book, The Soul of Black Folk, and that's the idea of finding Canaan, the promised land. And he suggests, look, emancipation, great, but that wasn't the end. That was the beginning of our exodus. And it's remarkable. Again, I want to go back and I want to encourage our viewers to get the book, buy Dr. Withun's book as well, so that you can...
Buy Du Bois's first.
Buy Du Bois's first. There you go. Buy Du Bois's book, because he points out something so beautiful, which is simply being declared free is not quite yet to be free. We need an education that will make us free, and that's going to take some time. And this is where I see him talking about the promised land. And you mentioned a quote, which is at the end of book 6, I believe, where he says, I sit with Aristotle, or I visit with Shakespeare, and they wince not, because they don't care what I look like or the color of my skin. And then he ends it with this very powerful statement, which is, and I wish I had the quote up, I don't.
I have it. If you want me to read it,
please read it for our read it for our audience. I think it's a very powerful, perhaps one of the most powerful quotes in the book.
Oh, I agree. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will. And they come all graciously, with no scorn nor condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest, peering from this high Pisgah, between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land?
The promised land. There it is. Are you afraid, O America, that we'll sight at the promised land? So it almost seems, at least from my reading, that there is a very clear connection between this type of education and the promised land. Give us some last few words about that. Classical education, Du Bois, and the promised land, and why. Now I want to hear your pitch. Why would it be important to make this education once again accessible to all of our children? Not just at private schools, not just in home schools, but all of our public schools should be returning to a classical education. The microphone is yours.
So I think that it's thank you, and but I think it's important and to again point to his mixing of symbols, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's referencing Plato's cave. He's referencing Plato and the idea of truth with a capital T. He's pointing to Moses standing on the mountaintop, looking out over the promised land. All of these things pointing to something that is higher, better, that is above the veil, the bigotries of the day, the particular situation that we're in, right? And that the particulars, the kind of isolated individual circumstances of our lives can be redirected to something higher, truth with a capital T in this case, right? And that each of us has a message to bring to the wider world, I think is also an important part of what Du Bois is saying in this passage and elsewhere. He has another passage in Dusk of Dawn in a later work written about 20 years after Souls of Black Folk, where he turns Plato's cave around. And the people in the cave are at the entrance of the cave, but there's a kind of plexiglass opening or plexiglass that covers the entrance, and they're pounding on it and they're screaming and they're trying to get their message of what it is like to be oppressed and the endurance of the human spirit, even in the worst of conditions. They're trying to get that message to those on the outside, but those on the outside can't hear them, right? And so for Du Bois, it's both transcending our individual in particular and rising above it to see the commonalities that we all have as human beings, to see the human condition as it is, and to be able to speak across those boundaries that we create for ourselves, but also to be able to communicate the particular situation that we find ourselves in to others. So sharing with them in a kind of commonality that also takes into account our individual differences as people and as members of various cultures and nations and so on, right? The particular is not lost or swallowed up in the universal, but becomes a part of the universal. And for Du Bois, and I believe as well, it is classical education, it's liberal education that makes that possible. To see yourself in the wider context of the history of the world, of the cultures of the world, of the great thinkers throughout our history, and then to be able to respond to them, whether it's sitting in a 7th grade Socratic seminar, or someday writing your own book that will be mandatory reading on somebody's great books list. You are participating in the great conversation by doing that. And I think that for me and for Du Bois, that's ultimately the purpose of an education.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Withun, who is also an author, and his book is linked to this YouTube channel. You can find it, the Oxford Press. Is that right?
Yes.
Oxford Press. That's right. And it will be available starting March 15th. So go ahead and put that on your calendar so you don't miss out on getting such a wonderful book. Also by W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest advocates of the classical education, or at the time known as a liberal arts education. Thank you so much, Dr. Withun, for being with us today. I hope to be able to have you back on in the future. Yes, would you be open to that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you
absolutely.
So much.
Thank you so much. And with that, we say goodbye. I'm going to go ahead and transition to our final page, where I'm going to talk to our guests about Heritage Classical Academy for a few minutes, and then we will say goodnight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasant evening with Dr. Withun. It's just such a pleasure to be able to talk about concepts such as truth, goodness, and beauty, honor, elevating one's soul, the word soul itself, virtue. These are terms that are so rare nowadays, and they're out of currency, especially in our schools. And our children are growing up in an environment where we talk about building their character, but we don't quite know how to do that anymore. A classical education, for this reason, is one of the best ways to do that, by bringing stories to children about great heroes of the past and the very, very near past as well. Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr. These are stories that inspire our children to think beyond their immediate circumstances, and it gives them the strength to be able to overcome their own trials. It gives us a compass on how we can live our lives today. That is why Heritage Classical Academy is not only sponsoring these live streams, but we're also trying to start our own classical school in Houston, Texas. How can you help us? It's very simple. Follow us, subscribe to our channel, click on that bell so you get notifications every time that we post or upload a video, and just follow us on our other social media platforms. You'll see them up on the screen right now. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as YouTube. Our webpage is www.heritageclassicalhouston.org. And with that, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to next time. Have a